Hi there, I'm Jude Isabella, Editor-in-Chief of Hakai Magazine. Welcome to the webinar, Interpreting Seaspiracy. For the record, Hakai Magazine represents independent journalism. We take accuracy and fairness very seriously. We don't have to fundraise. We have the privilege of being funded by a private family foundation based in Canada. No one tells us what to cover. We serve in the public interest. We wanted to do this webinar because the film Netflix released at the end of March touched on the issues we've explored and written about for the past 6 years since our launch. Our online publication, as many of you already know, focus on coastal science and societies. That's our beat, and we're passionate about it. Clearly, based on the response to critique we published about Seaspiracy, which has actually gone up to, I think, our 11th most read article ever in the span of this week, as well as the number of people who registered for this webinar, our take on the film has hit a nerve. There are a lot of people who agree with us. Ocean problems demand a more complex and inclusive conversation. We've also gotten a fair amount of heat. Some readers have written to us confused and angry. Why would we take issue with a film meant to get people to care about what happens to the ocean? We want to acknowledge that we all agree. We want to create a better future for the ocean and the people and animals who rely on it. The conversation we need to have deserves more than this webinar, but what we're hoping to achieve here today is to get people involved in a discussion. We want to go beyond a polarizing debate with only two sides. We're interested in discourse. So what are the parameters of this webinar? Well, we're not going to belabor the film's misleading scientific claims. A lot of that has been done already. We'd like to explore how films like Seaspiracy reinforce simplistic thinking on how we can solve global problems. The filmmaker's search for a single villain reduces the social, political, and environmental complexities at play into a one-note story that's more sensational than realistic. The points raised in the film are valid. Industrial fishing and industrial aquaculture have an outsized and negative effect on ecosystems and on human lives. But for untold generations, until fairly recently, really, as a species, we've more often fished sustainably than not. How this is accomplished is not a grand, unsolvable mystery. And there's a lot of work being done by people around the world to make fishing humane, sustainable, and inclusive. And the average person can get involved in a number of ways in what has to be a collective effort. We agree on the goal. Let's find a roadmap with a number of routes that help get us there. Now, one question I would like to address from the start is why not invite the filmmaker to the webinar to discuss his film? It's a bit like asking the author of a book you're reading to a book club. The discussion becomes solely about the author, but when somebody creates something, a book, a film, music, visual art, dance, they have no control over how an audience interprets their work. And this is what this webinar is about, interpreting a film through different perspectives with help from 3 panelists. Having said that, we're excited to hear your questions. There is a Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Please post your questions there, not comments. One of our editors at Hakai Magazine is keeping tabs of the questions that come in and sharing them with our host, Josh Silberg, a marine ecologist and science communicator. Josh, hello.
Hello. Thanks, Jude. So my name is Josh Silberg. As she said, I will be hosting this webinar. I'm really thrilled. The structure of this will have about 40 minutes with our panelists, who I'll introduce in a moment, and then we'll be able to spend the last 20 minutes or so answering those questions that you send in. So now I'd like to welcome our panelists in. I can introduce them. There they are. Thanks for coming. So first, I'd like to introduce Sarah Yo. Sarah is an assistant professor at the University of Utah, and her research looks at science communication, the intersection of science, media, and politics. Kimberly Oren is a former high school teacher. She's a small-scale fisheries advocate and a co-founder of a nonprofit called Fishing for Success, which is a enterprise in Petty Harbor, Newfoundland that creates a pathway for youth to connect with their fishing heritage. And last but not least, we have Phil Loring. Phil is a human ecologist specializing in coastal communities and the Errol Chair of Food Policy and Society at the University of Guelph in Ontario, Canada. So welcome to all three of you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah,
Thank you. So we're going to jump right in, and maybe I'll start with Sarah. I just want to start by saying, what was your initial impression when you watched the film about what it did well, maybe what it missed, and kind of how you felt after watching it?
Yeah, so I'm a communications professor, associate professor, actually. My sort of initial thought was about the ethics of the film and the journalistic ethics. And I sort of was wondering kind of just about some ethical considerations of the filmmaker, right? Which of course led me to classification of whether a documentary is a type of journalism. What is the goal of a documentary? Is it investigative journalism, right? Because that would be quite different from a documentary around advocacy. So the goals of that documentary, I kind of was wondering about that, I suppose. And that might, of course, be a question for the filmmaker, but we can kind of take away, what it is. On Netflix, it's classified as a documentary. In fact, I looked up the keywords, it has investigative on it. And so if I were to take this as a piece of investigative journalism, for example, I might question the ethics around that. And the Society of Professional Journalists has a whole code of ethics. And I think we can look through that and see that maybe there might lack some transparency, for example, in this type of reporting that was shown in the film. And that was sort of my initial impression of that film.
Thanks. Kimberly, how about you? After you watched the film, what were your initial thoughts?
Well, there really wasn't anything new in the film. I mean, everything that it showed in the film was just absolutely heartbreaking. And honestly, it's one of the big drivers behind what I do as an educator of young people, for example. It left out the other more than 50% of the people who fish as small-scale fishers or community fishers or Aboriginal fishers, food fishers, subsistence fishers, everybody who fishes for livelihood and food. And it missed out on the real opportunity to talk about the good things that are going on in rural communities all across the world, where people reconnect with nature, reconnect with their place in the food web. And I think that's what's really wrong with understanding where we fit within the food web and the food system, and how we can be part of nature and be sustainable, because humans have to eat. So how do we do that within an ecosystem and leave the least impact that we can when we eat? And so that's what I felt that they really missed out on. So I hope that we have some really great discussions here today. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a really great point. I think, how do we eat in a way that is the least harmful is probably something that everybody watching that film that we can discuss. So, I mean, I think that a lot of the people in the audience, we probably agree on many, many things, but the methods and others with the film might be where we might be able to discuss further. Phil, how about you?
Yeah, my first reaction was, oh boy. And, I actually went back to watch the movie again last night, because my first reaction as somebody who spends a lot of time working with fisheries science and who knows the papers that they talk about and spends a lot of time thinking about the big issues, while also working as a social science researcher with small scale fisher folk around the world. My first reaction was, this is an oversimplification. This raises really important issues, but it does so in a way that could be very harmful and counterproductive. And this question of just oversimplifying it, right from the start, yes, there's problems with the science that it presents, but yes, there's also a problem with how it presents it, and the sort of the discursive tricks for storytelling, and that really create this narrative that again is an oversimplification and sort of creates one problem with one bad guy and one solution.
Mm-hmm.
but I don't want to lose track of the big issues that are there in the movie as well, which, an overcorrection, I think, in response to the problems with the science, in some cases have done. It's almost unintentionally minimized some of the real problems that are on display in that film.
Right. That's a great point. Talking a little bit about the messenger, Sarah, you went into this a bit, and I know you've done a study looking at an inconvenient truth as an example, where you kind of manipulated it, showing to different audiences where you had either an expert, like a scientist, or a celebrity, or an anonymous narrator. And this was kind of none of those things. In some ways, it was this naive investigator on a journey of discovery. How does that affect how people view the film? Is this kind of a new tactic? And what are kind of the pros and cons to that?
Yeah, I mean, narrative storytelling is not a new tactic, right? But it is sort of this, it seems like this discovery in science communication. Oh, if I tell the story in a way that is narrative, it'll be received better. And so, I mean, it is a telling a story, right? The whole time you're watching this, it does create that sort of curiosity gap. You do want to learn more. And so, but narrative storytelling is just a strategy to communicate something, right? Which always kind of brings me back to the goals of the filmmaker. What are the goals of the filmmaker? And that's kind of what I was asking myself as I'm watching this. My understanding is that there's, again, if we return to journalism ethics, the accuracy is slightly questionable in this film. There's, maybe not completely incorrect information or incorrect facts, but it's sort of, some of them are outdated, for example, is what I understand. And so, again, narrative storytelling is a strategy. I return to whether the ethics of journalism, if indeed we are calling this a piece of investigative journalism, right? If the filmmakers adhere to these ethics in journalism is sort of what I was thinking the entire time, right?
Right. And yeah, so Kimberly, you mentioned a little bit about whose voices weren't in the film, and can you just explain a little bit about like who's a typical fisher or fisher folk that you work with, and then how you kind of differentiate between those different terms you use, like artisanal, small scale, commercial, compared to the industrial fishing, which is the kind of big problem that the film gets at?
Well, I mean, the film shows these huge nets and dragging the bottom, and the fish aren't spoken of as beings that share this world with us, and they're spoken of as stock, as commodity. Even the film talks about the price per pound, and we don't teach that in in all of the teaching that we talk about. We talk about fish as being and sharing this system with us, and humans are predators. And I mean, that's how the food web works. There's prey, there's predators, there's things that eat plants, there's things that survive on chemicals, and that's, humans have to fit into it somehow. And predators are important to the ecosystem. They keep the ecosystem healthy. And I think the fact that humans aren't connected to their food web anymore explains a lot of the reasons why we don't understand our place in nature. We don't understand the damage that we've done. We don't understand that just making this big blanket statement that they leave us with at the end, don't eat fish, is really a terrible way of saying that's how we can fix all of this huge tangly problem with the ocean. It's not the way to say it. I mean, teaching children where your food comes from and how to respect that and how to respect your food and not to waste it, and eating within your local ecosystem is really important. And once again, as I said, the idea about small scale fishing, you fish close to home, you use gear that doesn't damage the habitat, you handle the fish one at a time, you kill it quickly and humanely. You're not squashing it to death and with thousands of pounds of fish, and you're not dragging the bottoms so that you're destroying the habitat. It's a very different way of fishing, and you're sharing the fish locally with your community and providing them with food. when you look at the food insecurity of many rural communities across Newfoundland and Labrador, it's severe. And to tell people within communities that are food insecure that they can't eat fish is, I don't know where that's coming from. I mean, Newfoundland is an island. Labrador, although it's attached to the mainland of Canada, it's very rural areas, and they have to depend on protein from the sea. And you can't, the growing season is very short. It's very rocky country. We don't have pineapple patches and kale gardens. It's just not something that's going to happen. We have to be culturally empathetic and be very aware that humans eat different things depending on their geography. And we have to be sensitive to that. And creating this vitriol against cultures, I think, is more damaging than anything else that this film has done. So I was very sorry to see that that's happened, especially with the power that Netflix has to do good.
Thanks. That ties really nicely into the food security issue, which I know is something that Phil, you've looked at quite a bit, and how small scale fisheries plays into food security. Can you talk about how seafood, what role it has for food security in some of the places you've worked?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's correct to say, a lot of people rely on fish and seafood and mariculture and aquaculture for not just their jobs and livelihood security, but also their food and nutritional security. That is especially the case in small island nations in the north, in the Arctic. I've worked quite a bit in Alaska, for example, and doing research that shows very clearly that if you have access to locally caught fish, you are more food secure. We talk a lot about this thing that we call a global food system, but there's many different food systems in the world, and they don't all service the same people as well as others, and they don't all reach to the same places. If we're talking about places like Southeast Asia and Africa, small scale fisheries, or Latin America, coastal communities in all of these regions rely quite a bit on fish for protein. Anywhere from 15-20% in some places to upwards of 80%, depending on where you are. And they also rely on the jobs, and not just the jobs fishing, but the jobs mending the nets, the jobs drying the fish, the working at the market, the income across what people are now calling the value chain. And it's critical to local livelihoods and economies. And it's a very different proposition from the kind of fishing that we see sort of forwarded in this film as fishing, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. In that that there are many different types of fishing, and industrial, which is what they predominantly showed, is something that we probably all agree is not in a healthy place right now and could be improved upon in many, many ways. So yeah, so obviously we've talked a little bit about, that this film has been polarizing, including within environmental communities. Sarah, can you speak to a little bit about like polarization that comes out of these sorts of films, and what you've seen, maybe either how it relates to this film or climate change or other kind of similar controversial topics, so to speak?
Yeah, I think one of the issues, and Phil had touched on this earlier, is the dichotomy, is the creation of the dichotomy, right? And there's one side or the other, but obviously these are complex global issues that have nuance all through a spectrum. It's really not a two category issue, right? It's not two-sided, it's a continuum. And so I think what is hard to see from something like this, which certainly in terms of communication does reach out and grab the audience in ways that are very compelling, right? It uses emotion very well. For example, you can, you feel anger when you watch certain scenes. And again, this is what narrative storytelling is really good at, right? But it does also seem to simplify the issue. And so I wonder about, there are discussions around this and that have been ongoing for a long time, and this might be a focusing event. My issue with a focusing event that may not contain entirely accurate information is it doesn't give us all the same footing to have a conversation on. It sets us up for It's sort of how do you have a conversation around an issue when we can't agree on the basic facts around the issue, right? The basic scientific facts around the issue. And that's concerning to me when there's a dichotomy in any issue, right? And most scientific issues are complex enough that there shouldn't really be a dichotomy around it.
Right. Yeah. And that's one of the things that we've heard a lot of is they may have gotten a few things wrong. Even George Monbiot, who's in the film itself, wrote an article in The Guardian about, well, they got a few things wrong, but they started a conversation, and this is really important. And I think what you touched on there is a really good response to that. If we can't agree on the basic facts, one of which is there such a thing as a sustainable fishery as like a philosophy, does sustainability exist at all, sort of thing, then it's hard to have these conversations. Phil, you talked a little bit on Twitter about moral universalism, and that was one of the main issues. Can you explain a little bit what you meant by that?
Yeah, and you gave me a really great lead off by bringing up their comment about, is there really anything that we could call sustainability? I think there was a quote that really stuck with me in the film, which was the implication that if sustainability means you can just keep doing something forever and ever, does that mean you should do it forever and ever? And I thought, it's a good question that's being raised, and it brings in the point that sustainability ultimately can't just be a biological question. We have to look at the social, the moral, the ethical dimensions of what we're doing. I think that's really important. I think we often make a mistake, including in fisheries, of just assuming we can say, yep, the numbers work out, it's sustainable. And now here we are. And no doubt there's fisheries that some people might argue are sustainable, that ethically are questionable or unjust. And we need to have that conversation. But the moral universalism that you asked me about, it all comes down to this sort of the assumption that when we answer that question, there's just going to be one answer, that we're going to determine if fishing is right or wrong, and then there you go, there you have it. And it's it's a very sort of Western sort of colonial notion that there's going to be one right answer here. There's going to be one right way to live, one right ethical framing to understand our relationship with fish. And yes, these are living beings. These are feeling beings, and it matters that they feel pain, and it matters, as humans, that we think about what does it mean that we are killing or taking another life, and how do we think about that ethically? But it also, if you think about different cultures and different ways of knowing the world, it's not just fish or animals that are understood as being living agents, self-aware. Indigenous people for thousands of years have had stories in science that categorizes plants and other animals and even other aspects of the world as being sentient, agential, knowing beings. And so the pluralism comes into allowing people to answer that ethical question in a way that sees fit. It doesn't mean that we can't have, or we ought not have, conversations across cultures or among communities about what's right and what's wrong, and say, and be able to go out there and say, what you're doing here with sharks is not okay, or what you're doing here with dolphins is not okay. But it does mean that the conversation is never going to come down to just one right answer. And to get there, we need more context. We need more willingness to learn about people. There was a really missed opportunity in the Faroese whale hunt, for example, to spend more time talking about that community and that culture and that tradition, or to talk about it in Inuit communities, as was, whaling in Inuit communities, to get a sense that it's a completely different proposition. Fishing in one place in one way is not just fundamentally not the same as it is somewhere else.
There's no one fishing. I think one of the things that we've gotten at is it's very powerful as an emotional narrative to come up with an actionable step. And while their actionable step we might disagree with, that obviously has resonated quite a bit. So Kimberly, in your mind, if people are choosing to eat seafood, how can they best ensure that it's from sustainable practices? How can they and especially in places that might not even be coastal. So, I think the easy answer is you go down to the dock, but that's not available to everyone. So when you're looking for actionable steps, when you're looking at fishery, what are the kinds of things that you're looking for?
Yeah, the first thing, of course, as you mentioned, is to know your fishermen. that's the most ideal thing to do. And keep in mind also, there are inland fisheries and freshwater fisheries that you can participate in. And there are good aquaculture industries. Like, we shouldn't just say that all of them are bad. There are good ones too. And so it's actually, now that everybody's all fired up emotionally, start doing some research about the good versus the bad, because there are good systems. And getting involved in doing some internet searches for things like Ocean Wise and Sea Choice, and finding some of those places where you can have recommendations based on gear. Gear is one of the wonderful ways of figuring out whether the seafood that you're eating is caught in a sustainable way. Is the gear that is used, less impactful on the habitat? So the least impact that it has on the habitat, the better. Is it catching one fish at a time? Is it selective, so that it reduces the amount of bycatch, which is the fish that you don't want to eat? So you don't want to catch those. So you're just catching the target species. So all of those kinds of things are important.
That's an excellent answer. I mean, I think
where to start.
Yeah, it's knowing more about where it came from, and that could be knowing who caught it, how they caught it. I know that there's some traceability things in places like Japan where they're way ahead of us, where you can scan with your phone and you can get a lot more information.
And it's coming online here in Canada and the US too. I think the US is a little bit further along in Canada than we are. But I want to point out, like, this isn't just a fisheries problem. This isn't a food problem altogether, because there are farming practices that there's good versus bad. I was speaking to a friend of mine who is really big on farming, and he was just kind of amazed that the conclusion was don't eat fish, because he said there's good ways and bad ways to grow carrots. And you wouldn't then tell people, well, don't eat carrots. Well, you would have a discussion about, well, what's the best way to eat carrots so that I'm not using fertilizer that's derived from oil products, or so that I'm, using, it's just, he was just amazed that this was the implication of this film. So we have agricultural practices that are not good either. And so as eaters, we need to be really aware of eating food that has less impact on the environment. And so that comes to eating local and being aware of all of the food choices that we have.
Yeah, thanks. And so, I mean, we talked a little bit about the whole starting a conversation with a kind of imperfect message, potentially, but we're talking about it now. Is there, maybe this is for Sarah, is there an example, or actually any of you, of a documentary? I think one of the things that they fell back on, you kind of need to do this to reach this broader audience, which it clearly has through Netflix. These are people that have not necessarily thought of this, or they haven't thought of this deeply, etc. Is there a way, either an example of a documentary or a method that you've seen that includes kind of all the things that we've talked about, the diversity of opinions, but it still hits the emotional notes that kind of reaches a broader audience?
Yeah, so sorry.
Go ahead, Sarah. Yeah.
So I was thinking about this last night, and the emotions that it evoked, because one of my research areas is emotion. This one certainly drew a lot on anger. I was thinking recently about this 2018 documentary about science fairs called Inventing the Future. I think that's what it was called. I'll find out in a minute, but it came out in the same year as the South by Southwest Film Science Fairs came out, but they were both about science fairs, but this was a smaller one. And it was a very hopeful documentary. It showcased something that I think is really important: women in science, and scientists, budding scientists from other countries outside of kind of the US and Canada and the Western world. That was really very hopeful. And I left that feeling very different from when I watched Seaspiracy. So, and I think they did a really good job, because they use the same kind of strategies of narrative storytelling. They follow these young scientists right throughout their projects, to the kind of challenges that they face to get to this big science fair that's in the United States, but throughout the whole thing, it's a very hopeful message, right? And hopeful for science and the future of science.
Right. Yeah, that's really great points. That it's not necessarily that they used narrative that's a good thing in many cases, because I think you said it's effective. There's a reason they did it, and there's a reason that it's become so popular. It's how they did it that maybe we
right. Yeah, and again, the communication strategies of framing and using narrative storytelling, these are kind of ambiguous in terms of intention, right? It's sort of how we use them as people, as communicators, that matters.
Yeah, that's good. Phil or Kimberly, do you have examples of documentaries or programming that you've seen that's done a really good job at this?
Sure. Yeah, I was also thinking about this last night, and the reason that there's a film that's also on Netflix, incidentally, called Big Little Farm, and Big Little Farm is interesting. It's a story about a family developing in an orchard on a piece of land, and it's helpful to talk about it here because there's some similar themes to something that I believe Kimberly brought up earlier, which is that we've become sort of very alienated from our role in the natural world, from our possible roles in ecosystems. And the story in Big Little Farm is about the struggle of this family that decides to take over this orchard to figure out how to work with that land instead of fighting it, instead of fighting the pests, instead of fighting the climate. And it's like they keep oversteering, and they're working with somebody who knows the local ecology, and every time they think they've found a solution to something else happens. A new kind of water problem comes up, or a new kind of pest comes up, and it very effectively tells this, again, very hopeful story of showing that if we're willing to try and learn and not just assume that we can go into a relationship with the world with a specific technology and we're going to succeed by trying to control it, or in the case of conversation, succeed by trying to leave it alone, but figure out our roles and our relationships with the landscape in that case, or the seascape if we're talking about Seaspiracy. It does a really good job communicating that it's messy, it's going to be imperfect for a while, it takes some personal investment, but it's also rewarding, and ultimately possible to find a better working relationship with the rest of the natural world.
Yeah. Kimberly, is there anything that sticks out to you as far as science communication or programming that you think has done you maybe use similar methods but done a pretty good job at this?
I honestly, the best thing you can do is get people on the water, and that has been the most powerful thing. When you're out on the water and you've got all five senses engaged, so often we are doing what we're doing right now, which is we're in front of a computer, we're in front of a virtual screen, and it's such a flat, single dimensional thing, and we're inside a box, and we need to get outside, and we need to get near the water, and all of that five dimensions, and the temperature and the smells and the sounds, and being a little bit afraid, and the challenge of it, and getting in a little boat, getting out on the water, and you never know what you're going to see or find, and the adventure of it. And we think about throughout human history where that's been the very first thing that humans have done, is to wander down to the water's edge, and it has inspired us to create music and literature and artwork and describe our religions by using fishing terms. It's been something that has just embedded itself in us and has always been a part of who we are. It's been the easiest way for us to feed ourselves, by just gleaning and collecting from the shoreline what's washed up from the ocean. And, to deny our children this really deep experience of going out there and feeding themselves from the water and reconnecting with nature and where we are in this world. And right now, when the ocean needs us the most, we are looking for ways to connect our children through a virtual screen. We need to be getting our kids outside and back out on the water and learning how they're connected to all of this whole big gnarly system, because I want kids to try to figure out how to solve these big complex problems. And so I don't really have a film. I'm just trying to get kids out there now. have you challenged me to maybe tell the story of the little nonprofit that I started so that
Hey, there's always room for more. I think it shows that if this film has shown anything, it's that there's an appetite, no pun
yeah,
intended, for this this kind of discourse.
there is a little film about our Girls Who Fish program that we'd love for you to take a look at, and it was it won a third place prize in Women in Seafood. So we'd love for you to have a look at that, about encouraging girls and women to get in the boat, because we know that women have been discouraged from that activity. And so yeah, definitely take a look at that. But yeah, it's yeah, so thank you.
Thanks. Yeah.
It's nice to rely on the attendees. That documentary that I was referring to is called Inventing Tomorrow. So
Perfect.
Right.
Perfect. Thanks. I think we can get to a few questions from the audience that are being sent to me. One of the really good ones is the discussion of who's on our panel in the first place. There was talk of Christina Hicks, who was in the movie and expressed kind of her displeasure. We actually had Christina Hicks, and she unfortunately couldn't make it. So we did try for that. But one of the other big questions is, you're talking about factual inaccuracies, and why didn't we have a fisheries, a fisheries scientist in some ways? Maybe Sarah, could you talk a little bit about how you see fact checking and maybe countering these? How effective is that? Maybe it's speaking to the audience, and where is that important, and where is that maybe, how effective it is?
yeah, there's as you might guess, misinformation is a very big area of research in science communication and political communication. And the findings on how we correct misinformation are somewhat mixed, right? And so we don't have really good ways. It's not just on fact checkers to address the problem of misinformation, right? I think, again, it's too easy to fall into this dichotomy of, well, if we just fact check, then it'll be good, right? We'll have all the right information, and that's clearly not the case. In terms of when I watch the film and kind of thinking about the facts, because I do have a master's degree in oceanography, but I'm a microbial ecologist in a former life. But I don't know much about fisheries. And so I would rely on the experts in this area, right, who are watching the film to fact check. And so, that's kind of what I would turn to. I did notice, I tried to look up some of the sources. But I think either my eyesight's not that great or something, but it wasn't very clear to me which ones these were. And so I couldn't fact check it on my own. Plus I would have a lot of trouble reading some of the journal articles, I think, because it's not quite my area of expertise, right? And I think for a broader public, that's not reasonable, right? To be fact checking every journal article, that's just not reasonable. And so again, I rely on those who have expertise in this area to fact check that information.
So yeah, and I should say there have been groups that have fact checked. The filmmakers have also been showing their sources a little bit. In many cases, this show what it shows is different interpretations of the literature, what should be included, which sources are to be trusted, so to speak. And maybe speaking of that's a good segue as far as trust goes. There's talks about eco labels, and I know Kimberly mentioned a few, and there was discussion in the film of dolphin safe tuna and whether or not, maybe if either Phil or Kimberly, if you could comment on, what do you look for in an eco label, and maybe some of the things that are need work there or are really valuable there.
The first thing I look for is, of course, local, eating local. And the next thing, of course, is to, the labels are good if you have no other, if you don't have information about local. And if you don't, the best one, as I mentioned previously, was to know you're a fisherman or a woman, but most women just say, call me a fisherman. So, I mean, those are the top three ways to go. But I mean, honestly, personally, I don't know if all foods are actually meant to be global sources of food, because like I live in Petty Harbor, Newfoundland. Like, I don't expect to get kiwi up here. I mean, honestly, like, why should I expect to have kiwi up here? And so I think we need to rethink our food system. Is it appropriate, especially now that we have this COVID lens to look at things, and how this global distribution system for our food, maybe it will help us rethink how we want to distribute our food. And I don't know that a global distribution system for our food is really a good way to go anymore. And especially if we're thinking about the carbon footprint that moving food around has either. So if we're talking about sustainability, we really need to be thinking about local food, ecosystem, eating in our ecosystem, seasonal, eat things that are seasonal. And yeah, I think rethinking this whole system really is part of that too.
Yeah, Phil, thoughts on trust and eco labels and those sorts of issues?
Yeah, when you're so physically distanced or even just socially distanced from where your food comes from, it's harder to get the information you need to know if you can trust it, to know if it's going to be high quality, to know if the practices are going to be high quality, ethical, and just, in terms of your own guidelines for those things. And that's why people have innovated with things like eco labels. Is in theory, they're about adding some of the transparency back. They're about improving the information flow from the production, from the boat to the fork, or from the farm to the table. For better or worse, these industries, because they're so dominated by private industry, there's a lot of money and there's a lot of motivation and there's a lot of opportunity for corruption, large scale, small scale, major, minor. And so it's hard to know who to trust. It is a challenge. And again, the further far field you're going for your food, the harder that is going to be. But that doesn't mean that there's not options, that there's not possibilities to increase transparency, improve the flow of information so you can trust your food. Sometimes it's with labels. Sometimes it's with trusting on a reliable broker that has direct relationships, right? And for example, this is, I work with a community supported fishery. The fish that's in my freezer comes from a community supported fishery out west, and I trust them to trust their fishermen. I know, incidentally, also know some of their fishermen, and I know that they fish in a way that care about the environment, and that they make the best choices they can. They also try to pay good wages and so forth. And I have the means to do that. Of course, it's more expensive than going to buy farmed fish or farmed or other options at the store. But the direct relationships can be a really good way. Direct relationships, say in coffee, when a store, like if you're in Canada out west, the cooperative, federated cooperatives, they have direct relationships with their coffee farmers, which can far outperform things like fair trade coffee in terms of making sure the money gets to the farmers. So those relationships, if you have the desire to make a better decision, it's taken a little bit of time to look at the system that's giving you that eco label and who else relies on it and who else trusts it. There's a lot of good fisheries that have the Marine Stewardship Council blue tick on them. But there's also been a lot of challenges to that process, and a number of fishing communities that have experienced very negative impacts of the global rollout of MSC certifications and how it works. So it's a mixed bag. And so then you have organizations like Oceanwise and the Monterey Bay Aquarium. And more information is good, right? And so if you have the ability and time to sort of triangulate among those and then ultimately you have to make the decision that you think is best for you. And you're operating with uncertainty, and you can decide there's too much uncertainty, I'm just not going to. Or, people are going to have to figure out where their thresholds are.
Yeah.
The exciting opportunities that we all might think of too is using social media or using some phone apps to access some of the direct connections that we can develop with the people who produce our food. For example, one of those that's popping up here in Newfoundland and Labrador is called the Fish Market app. And this is hoping to connect directly consumers with fishermen. And so the fishermen it's sort of like a dating app for, the fish producers and the consumers that they want to feed, so that, they'll post, got fish, meet me at the wharf. And then you can go down to the wharf and get your fresh fish. And so that's, there's a number of different apps that you might be able to explore in your area or look at how that's going. And many of us are on Twitter and Instagram or different apps like that, and you could actually explore and see if the fish harvesters or the farm markets in your area are posting when their fresh food is available. And so that would be a way to make connections directly with the food producers.
Yeah, trust and relationships are really key to all this is what I'm hearing. And people are a lot of like, who should I believe? How do I decide? You know, it's a lot of work to do so. And it seems like one of the things you're saying is, you know, it's hard. And the more you talk to different people and kind of make judgment calls about who's trustworthy, which ones are imperfect, but maybe you have different thresholds. Yeah, these are all things that can go into decision. Unfortunately, there's no one way to make these decisions, and it partially comes down to personal. I'm just seeing with how much. Yeah, go ahead.
The making decisions as a consumer is an important way that we can try to affect change in fisheries and in other issues around the world, but it's not the only way, right? And we all often sort of feel relegated to just changing the world through what we buy, but there's other ways to push back against issues related to whales, issues related to marine conservation, and not just by buying things or donating to those organizations. And I just wanted to note that because we tend to just sort of fall back on our role as a consumer when we can also be activists and citizens and vote and protest and boycott and so forth.
Yeah. So I'm just seeing, just noting the time. One thing before we ask some positive leaving notes, I will say some of the questions that are coming in are talking about why we're not talking about population control. And I should say that that's a hugely problematic area. And I would encourage people to think about why talking about population control and overpopulation has racist, colonialist, and other backgrounds. And that there's a lot of problems when that's the answer that you bring up to questions about food sustainability. So I would just challenge anybody thinking about that to continue. We're not going to talk.
I would suggest wealth control before anything else.
Sure, and we can talk about other things, but yeah, lack of population control, I don't think is a very helpful way to come about this. Sarah, you have something to mention?
And I think one of the things that it highlights is that it is a very complex, interrelated system, and that it's hard to try to solve one of the problems without solving some of our other problems that we have.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, I'm hopeful. I think that the hope that I had for this webinar and why I wrote the article in the first place was, you know, that these nuanced discussions are happening. and I think the film kind of made it out like that they weren't, and that they hadn't heard of it. And you know, maybe I live in a bubble because I live on the West Coast of Canada and have studied these things. But you know, I'm always heartened by the discussions that are happening around food security and sustainability, and how scientists can better communicate to audiences that go beyond their bubbles and things like that. So in our last 10 minutes, I guess, on the communication element, Sarah, what kind of excites you about how you see science communication reaching different audiences in this kind of time?
Yeah, I mean, it's exciting to see the attention this kind of documentary gets, right? And this type of scientific issue gets. And I think the filmmakers have done a good job in terms of using strategic tactics to communicate their work. It's obviously been quite impactful, I think. You know, if they were measuring metrics according to their goals, right? Then I think they might find that they've been quite successful in using these communication strategies. And again, I mention this because strategies are what we make of them, right? Using emotion as a strategy, using narrative storytelling as a strategy. Often, you know, these are effective ways to reach audiences. And I would argue that this film is an effective way to reach an audience. But then we need to look back at sort of the goal of the film again, right? Is it advocacy? Is it investigative journalism? And so these are, you know, kinds of questions that I would really like to talk with the filmmakers about, actually. Be very interesting.
Yeah, and that's a conversation I think, you know, Jude mentioned at the beginning about, you know, how in this conversation at this time, and it's kind of like inviting the author to a book club. And we really didn't want to get into you know, that kind of back and forth at this time. But that's not to say that that back and forth is not a useful conversation to have, and talk to them about their motivations, maybe what they would do differently given the reaction to the film. One of the most interesting things that we've discussed here is like whether or not they wanted it to or not, these are the outcomes of how people watched it. And what they took away, whether or not they intended for small scale fisheries to be a voice or not. If that didn't come through to a majority of people, then it wasn't effective, whether that was a conscious or non-conscious decision. Yeah, Phil or Kimberly, anything that really gets you excited, or that's really gotten you thinking about either your work or moving forward?
Well, I'll just say that, you know, I feel like there were two different ways to come out of at the end of their film, that, and one of them is just a lot more positive than the other. You know, when I think about sort of the way that film ended, saying, okay, well, we need to stop, you know, eating, you know, living, feeling beings and just focus on plants. I thought to myself, well, what if we treated all of our food as if it had the same sort of moral standing and value as they're arguing we should treat fish and other you know, other animals that are more like us? How amazing would we treat agricultural ecosystems if we didn't just assume that they don't feel, so they don't matter? And then I thought to myself, well, you know what, there's actually a lot of people doing that, and that's one of the other reasons I brought up Big Little Farm, because I'm really excited by there are so many people right now who are working to interact differently and in much more respectful and caring ways, learning from our indigenous neighbors who have done this again for millennia, had, you know, worked and eaten with and hunted and fished with value systems that do respect the non-human neighbors that they rely on, but lots of people are working towards that right now in a way that's completely can reform their food systems, not based on better science or technology for the harvest, but based on a different understanding of the moral and ethical relationships and obligations therein. I'm excited by it because people are trying, and you don't see any of that in a film like this, but it is out there.
Nice. Kimberly, do you have any things that you left with that maybe, yeah, that are exciting to you, or that it like fires you up to continue kind of what you're doing?
Oh, definitely fired me up. Yeah, it definitely that we need to speak up more about the value of small scale fisheries in whatever form that may take, whether it's subsistence fishing, artisanal, or Aboriginal fisheries for livelihood and food. And, you know, and we talk like even our bodies are home to more bacterial cells than body cells. And so, you know, where do we draw the line about not killing animals? You know, we wash our hands and we wash away bacterial cells. And, you know, trees communicate with one another. Maybe we don't understand that trees are sentient. I don't know the answers to these things. There's so much that we don't understand about how living things communicate with one another. But we are all interconnected. Every living thing, whether we describe it as plant, animal, fungi, and so we all have to eat, and just eating less impactful, and finding a way to find exactly finding our niche in this place is very important, and respecting how each of us finds our own space here.
Yeah. Well, and on the communication front, one thing I was very pleased about in the film is that it discussed herring farts as a mode of communication, which was a study done in Western British Columbia. So I was very happy to see that that got a plug in the film. We're really thankful we had an overwhelming number of questions, and we're sorry that we can't get to them all. It's been really great to have these discussions, and we hope they continue. We have a few minutes left. One of the questions that came in, and I think this gets at people's desire for actionable items, is so if individual actions being kind of a difficult decision and a lot that go into it, what government or policy or these sorts of actions that people can take when it comes to people that maybe have a little bit more decision-making power in our jurisdictions? What are the sorts of things that we can talk to those people about, as well as the other people in our lives?
Well, I'll step in with this. Right now, the Department of Fisheries and Oceans here in Canada is asking for input on the blue economy. I mean, you can definitely step in and if you don't like the industrial fishing methods that you saw, definitely step in and say that you want to support fishing methods that don't damage the bottom and don't damage yeah, and that respect fish as individual beings and handle them one at a time. That's something that you can have your input in. And yeah, and I think that letter writing in support of fishing that's close to community and supports food insecurity and food sovereignty. And let's leave the high seas as a marine protected area. If we just took out fishing that occurs in the high seas, which is primarily what that shockumentary, is one of the comments on the Q&A, said there. If that fishing was just taken out, that would create the world's largest marine protected areas. And that's something that's been discussed by the UN and been discussed by a number of fisheries scientists. And so, I mean, definitely that's something that people could get involved in and supporting.
Yeah, that's nice. And it also gets at where we, I think, agree with, again, maybe not the methods, but the the talk of it as all fishing being industrial fishing, but that industrial fishing has its issues is something that I think we can definitely agree upon. Phil.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think if people are motivated to take on issues like these, and I hope more of them are, instead of, whereas the film turned its attention to the consumer, as I mentioned earlier, what if we turned that same attention, say, around the issue of slavery and fishing, to our federal government and to international trade organizations to understand, why is that still tolerated? Why is slavery still such a big issue? And instead of thinking that this is just a thing we have to solve with our dollar, how can we use science communication, documentary, investigative journalism to actually look at why in larger governance structures problems like that are allowed to persist? That's how you're going to solve them. You're not going to solve them by not eating tuna. And so I would like to see people who are motivated to be investigative journalists or documentary filmmakers do work like this, but in what we call in anthropology, studying up, looking to the bigger power structures that are really where these problems are deeply embedded.
Thanks.
Yeah, this is a whole systems problem, a systemic issue that not just voting with your wallet can change. I mean, this is going to require people working together. And like I think someone earlier mentioned, demonstrating and getting involved in social justice cooperatives in their communities to start drawing attention to, not just the issue of human slavery in high seas fishing, but even migratory workers that are involved in, picking our apples and pulling our potatoes out of the ground when that harvest season starts, because it's not just fishery that depends on marginalized people to harvest that industrial food. It's also industrial farming too that takes advantage of marginalized people to get that food to our tables. So thinking again about how we are so excited to buy cheap food and think, why is that food so cheap? Right. Who are we benefiting from when we're paying for cheap food? And thinking again about who's producing our food. And so all of that is a huge issue.
And Sarah, maybe from either a personal or communications and media, I think is, we see the power. It's like exponentially even more powerful with things like Netflix. When you see, what makes you hopeful for, how this maybe could be used in a different way?
Yeah, I mean, I think this really all speaks to kind of, so in communication, I think of efficacy, right, in terms of persuasive communication, but it's partly what can the individual do, self-efficacy, but also, examining, as both Kimberly and Phil have mentioned, kind of the larger structures that govern these practices as well. One thing I think that is coming up quite a little bit, I've kind of been following the Q&A a a lot of questions about the misinformation and the fact checking and the inaccuracies. And I know we're not addressing those here, but I think for those who are interested, there are links that you can follow where experts, people who are studying this are fact checking it. Phil, I think one of your students has written something. Is that accurate? And I don't know if we can drop that link somewhere. And I don't know, Josh, if that's linked in your own article, but I think those, if you are interested in the facts around it and where the misinformation is, or maybe the not quite accurate information is, then I think you might follow those links. I just wanted to mention that as well.
Yeah, and I think the purpose when I wrote the article was explicitly not to do that, but not to say that that information shouldn't exist and be done for the people that are looking for it. I think what I was thinking is a lot that that's not the only thing we need to do. I think sometimes it's easy to think that if it's called the deficit model, it's like if only they knew the real facts, then they would, and it gets away from the cultural and ethical, moral, historical decisions that go into who we are kind of and how we do
yeah,
this.
and also our values that kind of predisposes to one sort of side or the other, right? Given the dichotomous thinking shown, some of the facts will agree with our pre-existing views on this thing, and so it makes it much easier for us to accept those as fact, right?
Right. I chuckled a bit at people that, did they watch the whole film or did they watch the same thing that I did? And I thought, like, that's the whole point, right? Is like we watch things through the lenses based on our own values, and yeah, we will pull different things out of watching the exact same.
I like to imagine these as kind of filters, right, through which information comes through to get to us. And these filters are not only our own, which they certainly are, a lot of them are our own, but these filters also come from media, right? If we think about when we search for something, what do the algorithms show us? Well, that depends on who you are and what your search history is. And that's not very transparent either, right? We don't know how those media filters work.
Yeah, no, that's and that's a really great way. I think I'm just noticing the time that unfortunately we have to end this conversation, but we can have it online. But I think it is really wonderful to really that's what I mean. The main thing that I wanted to come out of this is we saw that film. We saw it, but we saw it differently, and that values and culture and something was something that was kind of missed from the film and a missed opportunity. I heard a lot of people lamenting the kind of missed opportunity that we could have this sorts of conversations, but within the film. I'd like to really thank all of our three panelists who've been wonderful today. So thank you so much for coming and adding your thoughts to this.
Yeah, thanks. It's been great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I really encourage people to read more, continue discussing online and being curious and asking questions and being polite to each other and not threatening, and acknowledging that we might differ, but doing so in a respectful way, which is not something we've necessarily seen come out of this film either. And yeah, we're allowed to disagree, but we agree on many things when it comes to wanting the oceans to, look differently than they do now. So thank you very much, and we'll see you later.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.